All right, so in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about a web server and GET requests. And let's just jump in and see what it is that I'm trying to talk about. All right, so this is pretty simple. This is just a basic HTML page, nothing fancy about it with the hello world. And so if we were to display or open up this in a browser, nothing fancy would happen. It would work, but it's certainly displaying it. But if I right click and I choose inspect element, we've been working with this before, but now we're going to start looking at this tab up here that says network. And network's going to give us information about how this page is interacting with the web server. Well, if I click on refresh 1,000 times, nothing is happening because, in fact, as we know, this file is being served locally. And locally, this browser knows how to display this HTML, so we're not experiencing any problems. But it's not interacting with the web server utilizing the HTTP protocol. This is a local file protocol. And on the internet, of course, we know that in order to get a web page, a request is sent from the browser to a web server. That web server receives that request and sends back to the browser the page or resources that were requested via a response. So this obviously isn't happening here. So what we're going to do is we're going to install a what's called Zamp. And Zamp is a software that will install for us a web server on our local machine, so we have a actual interaction with a web server. Now obviously, unless we have a dedicated IP address, we're not actually going to be on an internet, but we can replicate what's happening in the internet world. So go ahead and install Zamp, and here's what it looks like. There's the logo. I just did a search on Google for Zamp. I'm sure you all know how to do a Google search. And then you have various options for download, whether it be a Windows machine or a Mac machine. All right, so assumably, once you've got that all downloaded, here's what we're going to do. Nothing really magical happens once the download's done, so it's like, oh, what happened? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my Zamp software, and there it is. There's the control panel. So we don't really get to see any cool software, but there is this control panel that shows me that Zamp has been installed, but nothing interesting is happening yet. So when Zamp runs, it installs Apache, which is a software, web server software that has the ability to interact with with requests and responses to any machine that is actually connected and can receive responses from the internet. So Apache is a software. You might also have heard of IIS, Microsoft's IIS, or Nginx. MySQL is a way to interact with the database, but that's not something that we're going to be doing. So let's just deal with the Apache. So we're going to start the Apache software. So in other words, I want to start a web server here on my local machine so that I can interact with it. And once it's started, you can see that there's these things going on, and it says that Apache is started and it's listening on port 80, which is sort of a channel. It's like that's its specific address that this machine is going to be listening for requests. It's a listener that's just always going to be listening for requests on this particular channel. So Apache is now open and waiting to hear from any requests that are sent on channel 80. That seems really complicated, but for now, just recognize that Apache is currently running on this machine. So that means that, well, how does that work? All right, so if I type in the word localhost now, localhost is the IP address that Apache is sitting on and ready to display information. So if you get this screen, that means that Apache is listening, and it just sent a response back to you. In other words, how does that all work? Well, let me see if I can put this all together. Let's right click on this, for example. Let me just get started here, and I'm going to back to network. And now if I hit refresh, I'm getting some information that I didn't have before. And this information is saying that there was a page that was received by Apache on port 80, And it was, here is a GET request. So let's just kind of look at that for kind of an overview. So a request was sent via the browser. Presumably, let's see if we can see that this was, it just says the request URL was utilizing the HTTP protocol because we're sending information to a web server. Localhost dashboard, notice there's no file name, so I'm guessing that there's some kind of index or something along those lines. You should have learned that from your 130 beginning HTML class. So presumably there's some kind of default web page that's waiting to be served. The response was sent with a GET request. There is the IP address, which is, in this case, it's just a local machine as opposed to, like a domain name. And then it was listing on port 80. A request was sent and responses were sent back. Let me just double click on this word response. So response is giving us an idea of what the server sent back. So the server received a request for that default page, whatever it was, index something presumably. And then if you look at what was sent back, well, there's all the HTML stuff. So anything that is sent, looks like there is an error message here. So there's a 404 error message. So there was some file that wasn't found. So there is a response back from the server saying a request for feed.php was made, but I couldn't find it. So it returned a status of 404. Images are all sent with GET request. So every resource, whether it be a CSS page, whether it be an image, in this case there was some kind of PHP file that was sent, the server is going to receive that request, try to accommodate it, and then send back a message letting the browser know whether that request was satisfied or not. In this case, 200 means, yeah, all went well. In this case, something didn't work out quite right. All right, so let's see, parameters, no parameters were requested. Okay, we'll look at that in a minute. So let's kind of look a little bit more at this default thing that was being returned. So if I go into, and this is a key part of being able to use this local server, I'm going to go into my Windows Explorer and go to the C drive, and you'll notice now that you're going to have in the C drive a folder called Zamp. And so this is where the software Zamp was installed. There's a bunch of files that it installs on its own, but very important is this htdocs folder. And htdocs folder is where Apache is going to be looking for here and any of the folders within it for files to serve to the browser. So these are all available to be served up. And what does that mean? Let's see. Well, first of all, we said that there must be some kind of index file. Well, sure enough, if you look right here, there's an index.php file. And so that was the default file that was sent. So if you have index.php, that was what we saw in our request over here. In this case, it's a little bit more fancy because if we look at the source file of this, you'll see that there's PHP, and in fact what this PHP file is doing for whatever reason is it's redirecting this request to the dashboard directory. So if we look in the dashboard directory, and yours should have this too, if you look in the dashboard directory, you should then see an index file, and then this is the one that actually got served. So if we look at edit with PHP, and we look at the source here, now you should see the same source code, that we saw when we looked at our GET response. See, we have this dashboard. Well, we saw this earlier. I just can't expand it all the way here. So we saw this dashboard, and we said that there was, let's see if I can get this back. There's the response, and then I can't make this any bigger. It's hard to work with technology sometimes. Anyway, this is the same. See, it says response payload. Payload is what was returned. And this, in fact, is the file that we got returned to us in our local browser. So what we'll do is let's try this. All right, so a second ago, we saw this particular index file. This is actually a folder that I have on my desktop. And I want to be able to see this, have this file served to me through my web server. So how do I do that? All right, well, again, go back to File Explorer. I'm going to go onto my desktop then. Here's this folder that we just looked at, this Hello World. Right click on it and choose Cut. And so what we just agreed to was that Apache, my local web server, is looking in Zamp, and it's looking in htdocs for folders to serve up. So I'm going to paste this particular folder. Oh, I have this open in here, so it won't let me do it. Okay, so let's try it again. All right, so now I'm going to put that folder in this htdocs directory. Okay, so now Ajax is here. And while I'm here, I'm going to rename, or you can delete, whatever you want to do. I'm just going to rename it. I'm going to rename this to hold. So now in my htdocs folder, which is where the web server is looking for any files to be served to the browser, there is not a default web page. And so now if I run this again, so I'm going to reload. We're not going to go on dashboard directory. We're going to go back to localhost, which is the htdocs folder. You'll see that it doesn't have a page to load, and instead it's giving me a list of all of the folders that I have in that particular directory. So I've got lots of pages that I can serve on my local server. But here's the one we just did. There's the ajax.lesson. So I'm going to click on that. And you can see now that that page is being loaded. But you can also see the server response. So now we can see it's interacting with the server. It sent the method as a get method. There's the file. If I double click on it, we also can see that there was a status 200, and we can see the response was this payload, or the HTML that was generated. We can look and see the response and the request headers. So we can see here's our request to the server. Here's our response from the server. The server it's an Apache server, so it sent information about itself, gave me an idea when this file was last modified, etc., etc. So again, this web page now is sending a request to a local server. In this case, it's Apache, which we installed utilizing the Zamp software. And because we clicked on Start, this software is running, the server is running, and it's listening for requests from our browsers. Let's just double check. Let's click on Stop. So we're going to stop our local web server from running. And now when I refresh this, it's going to give me an error because the local host, the web server, is not running anymore. So let's get that back up and running. And let's try something else just out of curiosity. Just for complete demonstration purposes. Yes, that's all working. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back into, I guess I'll use Visual Studio Code for, all right, so what I'm going to do is we're going to open up that local folder that's in the htdocs, open folder. Remember, it's in C, and it's in Zamp, and it's in htdocs. And then there's all those folders. There's my Ajax folder. And what I want to do now, just for demonstration of kind of honing in a point. So here's that file. Now I'm going to create a link, href equals, and I just want to reiterate how a GET request works, that it sends any key value pairs that we request, in other words, data that you might have gotten from a form, for example, kind of a review, hopefully, from when you did forms in HTML. Let's do a request for a page, let's call it dogs.html. And if we're going to send dogs.html data via a GET request, that means that we embed the key value pairs in our URL. So we do that with a question mark. And maybe the key is dog, or let's say breed, and then equals, let's do a lab. And then if we have more than one key value pairs, it's separated with an ampersand. Let's do an age equals 5. And we'll do one more key value pair, and we'll say name equals spot. Okay, and then here is a link. Okay. So We need to also create that page real quick, so we'll just drum that up, dogs.html and HTML5. Didn't mean to do that. HTML5. Okay. All right. We'll just say dogs. Oops. Not quite what I meant to do there. Width equals device width. Okay. H2 dogs. All right. So the point here is that make sure that I'm running my Zamp software. I don't remember if I turned that back on again. I do have my software on. All right. So now I want to come back in. I'm going to reload my local page. And now I have my link. I can see that this page interacted with the web server. There's my get and my response methods and my response and requests. It was sent as a get request, and it came back with a 200 status code. Let's see. If I double click on it, then I can get parameters. No parameters were sent, but I did get a response back, and that's the HTML page. But here's the point. So now if I hold my cursor over our link, and if I move my cursor, I'll miss it. But if you look in the bottom of the screen, you'll see that HTTP localhost bottom left. My status bar has the question mark breed equals lab age. So I'm sending key value pairs via that link in a get request. And the reason I know that is because it's in my URL. So if I click on this link, you'll see that the dogs page got delivered. You'll see that there was this key value pairs that was embedded in this get request string. And now if I double click on get and I look in params, in other words parameters, you should see my key value pairs. There's my query string. And so by sending a get request, we're actually sending data to another page via the URL. And this comes in handy when we start looking at how we're going to send information to our web services to get data back via the JSON files.